once again, thank you guys for coming. This talk is a little favorite of mine because we started giving this over a decade ago, and it was just a 1-hour thing, and it's grown since then, and it's been supported by student groups because the history of medicine it's important in lots of different ways. It can be a resource for you in your career, and it's important that even though osteopathy is a distinctive career and it distinct from allopathic medicine, it didn't just appear miraculously with A.T. Still. There was a whole history of medicine in the world before that, and it's good to have some grounding on the developments and the amazing things that happened, the terrible things that happened, and we're going to cover those all in extreme detail as best we can. So we're going to start with this first session looking at ancient medicine as best we can reconstruct it, and moving up to the Renaissance. After that, we're going to split and follow different paths of medical development, the history of concepts of disease, what actually makes people sick, the histories of different treatments, then moving into the history of surgery, and then looking into kind of lost opportunities in medical development and people who were excluded from that mainline track of medical development and how those were rectified and still are being rectified. So the first actual evidence we have of any kind of ancient medicine is trepanation. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't other types of medical treatment going on, but this is the only thing that left a lasting impact for us to actually find. And my lovely family is here, and they have a skull. We're going to pass that around, so everybody pass the skull. It is a cast, so it is not a real skull, but that doesn't mean you can drink out of it. Wow, rough crowd. Okay. But basically, trepanation is creating a hole in the skull. Now, we still do this when we have to deal with hematomas, blood clots, things like that, but the idea is this was not done for emergent situations back in ancient times. Rather, it was because disease and spirituality have always been very closely linked. So why on earth would you want to drill a hole in someone's skull? What were you going to try to treat that way? And just go ahead and shout. What's that? Spirits. Good or bad? Probably bad. You're not going to drill into someone's head because they're so nice. So you're probably trying to deal with bad spirits, maybe someone following an injury, they are lower consciousness, they're not able to function as well. Maybe it's because you think there's an evil spirit inside. And this has been practiced all throughout the world, but it actually was done at a fairly high level. And in Peru, there's actually been quite a few skulls found with evidence of healing. So if you take a look at these two skulls, which one survived? The one on the right or the one on the left? Probably not both. The one on the right, what's that hole look like? It's smooth. That's bone that's had a chance to heal, a chance to restore. Whereas on the left, still pretty hard notches in there. That person probably did not make it through the procedure. But interestingly, some neurosurgeons in South America several years back actually did craniotomies using Stone Age tools and found they actually did a pretty decent job. So you can actually get quite a bit done. And it's thought that they would kind of chip into the skull and not pass through the dura mater. They would just try to get through the skull and leave the dura intact. Now, who has played this game in their life? Okay, great game, Operation. I think this next thing is a joke, but if anyone ever finds out there's any hint of truth, I want this game so bad. So if anyone ever sees that this is not just the internet joking around, let me know. I want trepanation the game. All right, so ancient Peruvians especially performed trepanations at a fairly high caliber. They were able to do it regularly. And another aspect of spiritual healing that was common not just in South and Central America, but throughout the world, was use of animals either to forecast the process of disease or to actually act as a surrogate for the disease. So guinea pigs in Peru were actually held over the affected area with the idea being once you opened up the injury, it would transfer to the animal, and then you can inspect the animal's organs to see what the problem actually was. So yeah, it doesn't really accord with our theories about how disease operates, but that was what they were working with. And similar theories existed throughout the entire world. One quick example of that, who's ever heard of the phrase a scapegoat? So a scapegoat was quite literally a goat that was sacrificed to appease someone else's transgression. It was basically thought that, well, I did a bad thing, but it can be better if I have this goat sacrificed to take my place in terms of being punished. So that theory goes back a long ways. Now, moving into the Middle East, Assyria and Babylon, ancient Near East cultures, disease was largely considered to be supernatural in origin. It was thought that there were demons that would attack people and make them ill. There could be familial curses going from one generation to the next. There were witches and warlocks who could put spells on people and make them ill. And diagnosis was largely done, again, by sacrificing animals and looking for abnormalities in their organs. And they would use maps of the organs. That's what's on the left here. That is the map of a liver. And if they found a tumor or a malformation or a bruise or some such thing on the liver of the animal, they would use that map to interpret what the actual cause was and what they would have to do to help treat the person thereafter. Treatment was interesting in that there were priests who could try to pray or intervene on behalf of the patient, but they also had secular healers who could do things like bone setting, offer medicines, and so forth. So one of the first things that we have evidence of medically from that era is Hammurabi's Code, and that's one of the earliest law codes that we actually have evidence of. So the Babylonian king, roughly 1792 to 1750 BCE, set down a code of laws that had a lot of different aspects, but one of them was on reimbursing physicians, but also punishing them if they messed up. So if you think malpractice is bad now, just, enjoy this. If a doctor has treated a free man with a metal knife for a severe wound and has cured the free man, or has opened the free man's tumor with a metal knife and cured a free man's eye, he shall receive 10 shekels of silver. Not so bad. I do not know what a shekel is worth these days, but probably not bad. However, if you mess up or has destroyed the man's eye or caused him to die, the physician's hands shall be cut off. Okay, so could be a little bit worse than paying malpractice insurance. Egyptians were really well known for the embalming methods they used to create mummies. And what's fascinating about this is the people who did the mummification had a really intricate, kind of time to interact with the organs, because they would remove the brain, they would remove all the internal organs except for the heart, put them into what were called canopic jars that we see there, and then those jars were put back into the body, wrapped up, and mummified. These people who were working with the actual organs had, as far as we can tell, zero interaction with the medical people in Egypt. And this knowledge of the internal anatomy had nothing to do with their theory of disease, how disease progressed, or how to treat it. So it's just fascinating that you have this process going on, and yet it's not going to be translated over to their medical practice. So what the Egyptians did have was a theory that was called flux. And this is simplifying it a bit, but flux is the idea that you could have bad food start rotting inside your body. And that bad food would then flux or move to other parts of your body. So if you ate something bad, it would kind of move throughout your body and maybe create a tumor that would grow somewhere. You'd have an infection or a boil, some sort of an infection that would develop on your body. And the thought was it's because you ate something bad and you needed to rebalance your internal environment by purging, bleeding, other things of that nature. Enemas were given, purgatives to vomit, massage was also done. And the Egyptians had a really extensive herbal and what we'll call a pharmaceutical list committed to papyrus, which is why we still have it. Papyrus is kind of woven reeds pressed together. Normally this would rot if you weren't in a desert area, but thankfully Egypt is a desert area, and these were able to be read and maintained for many, many years, and that's how we know a lot about how the Egyptians actually created a lot of their pharmaceutical products. Another thing they did involves the spiritual aspect of medicine, in that if someone was ill, they would go to a temple for treatment. And the temple was a temple of Imhotep, and yes, that is the name of the bad guy from the Mummy movies. Brendan Fraser? Yeah, they're fun. Okay. So Imhotep is thought to actually have been a historical person. He was an architect for the pharaoh, but also a physician. And in these temples to Imhotep, the patients would go up to the temple, they would stay there and be cared for by the priests and priestesses of the temple until they had what was called a therapeutic dream, where it was revealed what they should do to change their life, change their behavior, to improve their condition. And this theory caught on really big with Greek mercenaries who were working in Egypt and then returned back to Greece and brought that idea of temple incubation back with them. But instead of Imhotep, these temples were associated with Asclepius. Now, Asclepius is a mythological character, but may be based on a real person. It's just so far back in the mists of time, we do not know. But Asclepius had temples that were kind of erected in Greece, and as the son of Apollo, he was thought to be able to heal people. And the myth goes that he was so good at it, he started bringing the dead back to life. Hades didn't like that because, A, there weren't any people in Hades for him to rule over, and B, the humans were getting too powerful if they could be immortal. So Zeus smote Asclepius, but then immediately made him a god. Now, back to what we're concerned about. These temples were largely in rural, mountainous areas. Lots of good air, lots of good water. So people could go there, wait for their therapeutic dream, and they were also going to be breathing good air, drinking good water, having good quality food. So their likelihood of coming to a place where they could heal was pretty decent. And another thing that happened at these temples is there were lots of snakes. Now, why would you want non-poisonous snakes in a temple area? What are snakes going to do for you? Rodents, vermin, yeah, they're going to eat those. And there's a nice little metaphor for snakes too, because what do snakes do that might be suggestive of someone casting off their diseased state? They shed their skin. So there's kind of a nice little harmony there too, with snakes as a symbol for recovery from an illness. And just FYI, the snakes on Hermes' staff, there are two snakes wrapped around the staff. That's the staff of Hermes, god of commerce, thieves, and messengers. I don't know why he caught all those, but that's the staff of Hermes. The actual staff of Asclepius has a single snake wrapped around it. So healing has that single snake. And, oh man, looky there, wow, crazy. So you can always think like, yeah, it's even on our logo. As DOs, you're all about healing people, not getting the maximum amount of money out of them. There we go. Polite laughter fills the room. Okay. So legends of Asclepius were that he was taught healing by a centaur named Chiron, who taught him a lot of the secrets of healing people, and he got so good that he was actually trespassing on the god's domain, and he was then revered as a god thereafter. Just take a moment and read the tweet here, tweet. Take a moment. Can you guys read it? Is it too big, too small? Just in case you can't, according to Greek mythology, Chiron was a half-horse, half-human doctor. This made him the centaur for disease control. He was a strong supporter of herd immunity and could make someone healthy as a horse. Ba-dum-bum. And I don't have an answer for the next one, but if centaurs wore pants, how would they wear pants? Moving on. Now, the mythological Asclepius also had children, and two of them were specifically linked to healing in a way that we can still understand. This was Hygeia and Panacea. Now, Hygeia clearly kind of echoes hygiene, preventative disease, public welfare, and good public health methods to stop disease from happening. And panacea is a word you don't hear as often anymore, but it was used to mean a cure for all ailments. A panacea is something that cured everything. And Panacea was the goddess of intervention and going to help someone after they'd already fallen ill. So even then, ancient Greece had that idea of those two separate aspects of medicine, dealing with someone who's already ill, but also stopping illness from taking root in the first place. All right, so this is a talk about medical history, but because the three great Greek philosophers permeate so much thought from Greek history up until the Renaissance and beyond, it's important that we talk a little bit about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Now, Aristotle is the only one of those who actually talked about medicine directly in his works, because Aristotle talked about everything, but their thought had a lot to do with development of intellectual thought in the scientific revolution, development of proto-science in the Middle Ages as well as the Renaissance. So let's do a quick gloss of these so we can see how their thought develops alongside medical development. So Socrates, roughly 400 BC, was all about having his fellow Athenians examine their own beliefs and kind of really interrogating them about what they knew, how they knew it, and if they really did have a firm grounding in what they understood. His student Plato saw the natural world as a reflection of an idealized world called the world of forms, where we see tables here, but it's only because we remember from our time in the pre-life that there was this one perfect table that we remember, and we see imperfect echoes of it in every other table we see here. And Aristotle, student of Plato, did almost the opposite. He looked at the world itself and tried to come up with ways to describe the world. You'd think this would lead to a scientific approach, but Aristotle was more about looking at the world and making generalities and then expanding on those generalities without actually checking to see if he was right about it. I think he said that horses had a certain number of teeth, and that was repeated for several hundred of years before people actually thought, we should actually go count the number of teeth that horses have to see if Aristotle was right. So these three were very influential in all kinds of intellectual thought in the Western tradition, and they had a massive impact in a lot of ways. And one of the ancient Greek impacts that I think was very negative is this culture was very much about segregating manual labor from intellectual thought. And which one do you think was good? What, if you were an ideal person in ancient Greek society, were you getting your hands dirty, or were you walking around thinking deep thoughts all the time? Yeah, so you're basically thinking, and that's the key thing. Now, I think this is crap, but we still have this distinction of there's smart people and there's people who work with their hands. And honestly, there are plenty of smart people who work with their hands, as we know. And knowing how things work can help you know how to intercede with things. But the ancient Greeks gave us this really, really kind of stark dichotomy of, okay, there's intellectual and then there's manual. It's okay, it happens to the best of us. So, just real quick, this is a picture of the School of Athens by Raphael. It's over in the Vatican. And right in the center we've got Plato and Aristotle, Plato pointing up to the sky, saying like, yeah, the ideals are up there. Aristotle pointing down, no, we should look at the stuff on the earth. And fun fact, Raphael based Plato on Leonardo da Vinci, who we're actually going to hear more about in this lecture coming along as well. All right, so our first major name of a person we are pretty sure actually existed is Hippocrates, the quote-unquote father of Western medicine. And Hippocrates is the father of Western medicine because he basically, quote-unquote, divorced spirituality and medicine in the way that medicine was not supposed to be appealing to spiritual causes, but looking for physical causes that you could diagnose, intervene with, and treat. Thought being basically that, well, if it's supernatural, there's nothing we can really do about it, but if it's physical, we can watch the patient, observe the progress of their disease, and find the right time to intervene. And his theory really worked out very well because the Hippocratic physicians were very cognizant of staying with their patients, held a high moral standard. They swore to the Hippocratic Oath, which is something no other physicians at the time did, was hold themselves to a professional standard of behavior. And the fact that they were observing diseases and how they progressed meant they could, in fact, intercede in a helpful way once in a while, despite the fact that the theory of disease that they operated under was completely at odds with what we now know to be the functioning of the human body. Just goes to show that good effort can have some results even if you're operating under mistaken assumptions. So the idea here is that the body has 4 humors in it. We have blood. That corresponds to air, makes us energetic. The kind of adjective for that is sanguine. If you're very sanguine, you're happy, you're lively. Fire corresponds to yellow bile. That's what we consider the bile from the gallbladder. And if you're bilious, you've got too much yellow bile, it makes you angry and it makes you upset at things. If you have too much black bile, melas coli, it makes you sad, makes you melancholy. That's one of these we still hear every so often. And phlegm corresponds to water, and you're kind of slow and sluggish if you're phlegmatic and you're not moving around too quick. Other fun thing, the ancient Greeks thought that the brain was just extra padding for the CSF, or that fluid in the brain, and that when you got a runny nose, it was actually your brain leaking out of your nose when you got a cold. So we've got the 4 humors there, and they were linked to the 4 elements, and you'll still hear echoes of this even today. So we've got things that are hot and cold. We have things that are dry and wet. And let's think about being phlegmatic for a minute. So phlegmatic means you're kind of sluggish and slow. What's it like when you have a cold? Let's give yourself a nice, nasty nasal infection. What are you acting like? Slow, sluggish. You're kind of wet. because you got that sludge. And think back, maybe your grandma, maybe your mom, maybe somebody in your life told you this. What's going to happen to you if you walk outside in the rain without a coat? You're going to catch a cold. Yeah, so if you're cold and wet, that phlegm's going to get you. So basically, the phlegm was associated with the properties of being cold and wet, black bile with being dry and cold, yellow bile dry and hot were associated with blood, which makes sense. Blood is hot and wet. And this was used as a way to treat people. If you have too much blood, well, you could remove it, but maybe you could feed someone something that was dry and cold. Maybe you could keep them in a dry, cool area to calm them down, get their body to get off of that heat associated with the blood. And it was thought that the balance of humors that you had kind of set your resting temperament. If you were sanguine, happy, melancholy, bilious, or phlegmatic, it was kind of a natural thing based on your natural state of humors, but everybody had to bring them back into harmony if they got out of whack. So the Hippocratic methods for treating this were very similar in a lot of ways to the Egyptian. They had herbs, they would use purgatives, people would be sweated or massaged. They actually used cupping as well to kind of try to move those humors around the body. And bleeding is the one that was probably the easiest and the one that got used the most throughout history. Somebody's got too much blood, well, there's an easy answer to that. You just take a few pints out through one of the superficial veins. One thing I love is that massage and manipulation were actually known and encouraged by the Hippocratics. We have no idea what manner of manipulation that was, but there's this nice illustration of this thing that I'm told is not a torture device, but actually a medical treatment device. Kind of coin flip for what it actually did to the person, but that was the idea. Now, all of that talk about the humors raises an important question, and I think your generation can help me answer it. Is Hippocrates one of the avatars? Seems like he mastered all 4 elements, right? Okay, cool. Okay, that was a good response. I'm proud of you guys. All right, now, one interesting thing here is that ancient Greece, as well as India and China, there are some similarities in these medical theories, and I can't really say that they're traceable back to any single protoculture, much like Indo-European languages, covered a large area. But it's really interesting that the concepts of returning the body to balance and the connection of these processes to different elements are present in all these places. Ayurvedic medicine from India, you have the ideas that doshas and other aspects of personality and energetic kind of status come from the interaction of air, earth, water, fire, and ether. Sometimes there's 4, sometimes there's 5 elements. Whereas in China, this is an incredibly generalized statement. A lot of the theory of medical treatment is based around the 5 elements and how they both generate each other and counter or overcome each other. So wood generates fire, fire generates earth like ash, but fire can be countered by water, fire can counter metal by melting it, and these were used to link the theories of disease in those cultures as well. Now, that's as far as I can go down that particular rabbit hole because I'm not qualified to go much further about traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurveda. It's very interesting. One day I hope to know more. But we're going to be covering basically the path of Western scientific medicine from here on out. But just be aware, there's some very intriguing links to medicine worldwide, including a lot we don't know about indigenous medicine from other cultures. Now, in Egypt, after Alexander the Great came along and founded lots and lots of cities named Alexandria, we have Alexandria in Egypt forming a site for a lot of activity intellectually. The library, as well as the museum at Alexandria, brought scholars from all over the world, and at least 2 of these were considered early anatomists, Herophilus and Erasistratus. I always stumble over that name. Now, we don't know a whole lot about these guys because we don't have copies of their work, only references to their work by later authors. But apparently Herophilus is the first person to figure out that the heartbeat and the pulse are actually correlated. And Erasistratus developed what's called pneumatic theory that expanded upon humoral theory. And this idea is that inside the different parts of our body, like the vessels and the nerves, we have different fluids called pneuma that were traveling around. So we had vital spirit in our arteries, and that became animal spirit in the ventricles of the heart, and then that got pumped out to our muscles by way of the nerves. So we were actually pumping our muscles full of fluid through these nerves, according to their theory. Erasistratus, I think, was actually chased out of Alexandria because it was kind of assumed that he was actually doing dissections on live people. But this is one of the few times we actually see pre-Middle Age dissection happening, because it was very much forbidden in ancient Greek and Roman cultures. Speaking of Rome, the big name there is a guy named Galen of Pergamum. Now, he was a Greek living in the Roman era. He came from an area that's now in Turkey called Pergamum, and he decided that he really didn't like how the Hippocratic teachings had been diluted, expanded upon, had become contradictory because so many people added so many different things to it. He wanted to get back to the core teachings of Hippocrates and then develop on those his own research. So he traveled to Rome, and on the way he also worked as a physician in a gladiatorial arena, so it's about as good a shot as you're going to get at seeing anatomy for real by treating the wounds of gladiators. Became eventually the physician to the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and he was very much an experimentalist. He really wanted to kind of purify Hippocratic teachings, but he went beyond that and did a lot of dissections on animals to show what the nerves did. He would cut nerves to show that they just stopped muscles from working. He found specifically the recurrent laryngeal nerve and cut it to stop the squealing of a pig. Yeah, it's a little gruesome, but it was the old days. And showed a lot of different things through experimental activity. And his teachings encompassed everything from medicine to physiology to anatomy. And the problem is, he did a lot of good work, but his system included a lot of factual errors because he was never working on humans. And he made a lot of intellectual leaps of faith that if it worked one way here, it had to work the same way somewhere else. This wouldn't necessarily be a problem, except this is a pre-scientific society. So you get status by talking about how absolutely infallible you are. And he's quoted as saying, "Whoever seeks fame by their deeds, not by learned speech alone, need only become familiar at little cost of trouble with what I have achieved by active research during the course of my entire life." Translation, don't bother trying to do further experiments. I've already figured everything out. You just need to read my books. Now, he was taken very seriously. And let me just give you a couple instances for why that's a problem. His work had a lot of advancements in it, but it also contained a lot of things that are just plain wrong. So we're going to do a quick run-through of Galenic pneumatic theory. So first off, you eat food. That food gets transformed into chyle, not with a K, but a CH. And that goes to your liver and is transmuted into blood. And that's where it gets natural spirit added to it. That's the first kind of pneuma, or the first kind of spirit added to your system. The blood just kind of washes out from the liver to the organs according to their needs. The organs kind of put out a call to the liver for how much blood they need at any one time, and the liver just kind of lets it flow through the veins to get there. Now, the blood can develop some impurities, and that's going to be dealt with by traveling through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, and that's going to get the impurities breathed out. But when air in the lungs comes back, it travels literally as air through the pulmonary veins. He thought that the pulmonary veins were full of air, and that it went to the right atrium and right ventricle, and then that air passed through little pores, and blood passed through little pores in the ventricle, and that when they mixed in the left ventricle, it imbued that blood with what is called vital spirit, spirit that helps us move. And that's pumped up to the base of our brain, where an organ called the rete mirabile, the miraculous net, it's literally its name, transforms it into animal spirit, and animal spirit is what is then pumped through our hollow hollow nerves. He thought the nerves were all hollow, and out to the muscles. And think about it, it's pneumatic. We call it that because think about a pneumatic process where water's pumped into something. If you grab your bicep and you contract it, what's your bicep do? It swells up a little bit. So yeah, the thought was these muscles are contracting because our brain is pumping fluid into them, and that's what makes them actually swell up and shorten like that. So this is, just a small part of Galenic theory. And quote, one thing to know, the rete mirabile, the centerpiece for his whole physiology, it exists in some animals, but it's not present in humans. But Galen assumed if it worked one place in one way, it had to work that way everywhere. Now, problem is, Galen was taken very, very seriously. He was, held up as the key physician that everybody had to know. And what are the things that actually led to that? Well, Galen saw that the body had been created by what he called the demiurge. He was a Greek living in Roman times, so this is not the same as a god with a capital G that we might think of. But the demiurge was the creator of the body, and this was something that could actually be, reconciled with the monotheistic religions that came through Europe and the Middle East thereafter. So as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam came along, making it God with a capital G instead of the demiurge was not a big step. Galen's writings were widely translated into Latin, Greek, Arabic, back into Latin. Sometimes they came back around. And he was well read in the medieval and Renaissance world. And his methods that he used to get his results were less important to people than the results themselves. So people really just said, well, it's true because Galen said so, and that's why we have to know about it. So when his system was actually surpassed, it's because people started doing experiments again because they would notice actual problems with what he said, that things that he said didn't actually occur. So I want to give you a quick run through. Who's taken some history classes in here? Okay, a few of you. So just buckle up. When I say Galenic theory was relatively unquestioned for 1,300 years, that sounds bad. And it is bad, but let's actually go through just a few of the highlights of what happened around the world in that 1,300 years when medical practice stagnated in this area. So, we have the Roman Empire. Okay, it's at its height. It's doing great. Anglo-Saxons invade Britain. Okay, the Muslim conquest of Spain happens. So coming through Africa into Spain, Constantine moves the capital of Rome to Constantinople. And then the Western Roman Empire falls, but Constantinople's still there. Charlemagne from France is crowned the first Holy Roman Emperor, trying to make the Roman Empire come back. Vikings raid from Northern Europe all throughout the rest of Europe, including Sicily. The Vikings actually landed and did a lot in Sicily, which surprised me. The Magna Carta limits British royalty's authority. The Crusades, lots of them, move from Europe to the Middle East. The Eastern Roman Empire falls. And then the New World is quote-unquote discovered by Christopher Columbus, and the Reconquista of Spain is accomplished in the exact same year, 1492. The Protestant Reformation sweeps through Northern Europe, and the Renaissance and Enlightenment begin. All this time, medical theory remained pretty much as it was the whole time. So what was going on between Galen and all those other times where medical theory remained relatively stable? There were some developments, and largely because after the fall of Rome, the scholars who had worked in the Greek and Roman world were able to move into the recently established Islamic empires and into places like Baghdad and Damascus, where there were called houses of wisdom that were founded to have scholars work on things and maintain that. And Islamic intellectuals did a great deal of work with astronomy, mathematics. Medicine was not near the top of what they did, but a lot of that learning from the Western cultures was maintained through those scholars in Damascus and Baghdad. So pharmacy, chemistry and alchemy were huge in the Islamic empires. And even though surgery was mostly forbidden because people were not allowed to cut into a body, it was thought that cataracts didn't quite count because you would just move the lens around. So Islamic physicians actually figured out how to treat cataracts by moving the milky lens out of its place and letting light into the eye thereafter. So eye operations were actually allowed because you weren't actually cutting into the body. So a few of the main people who were very pivotal in this area is Rhazes, or Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi. Yeah, I got it in one go. So he was active in, in the Persian area around Baghdad, and he used humoral theory that was inherited from Galen to distinguish diseases from each other. And his big contribution was trying to look at how you could categorize different diseases. And he was one of the scholars doing that. There were several to follow him. But he also brought a lot of chemical and, at the time, alchemical research into medicine to try to figure out how to distill different things, how to make medicines from plant sources, from botanicals and so forth. We'll talk more about that when we get to treatment in the third lecture. And interestingly, he was considered a very free thinker who did not take Galen as completely infallible, nor the other Greek philosophers. And he actually got into trouble for questioning the authority of some of these older sources and was actually beaten and went blind in one eye because he was considered to have said something that was sacrilegious, not necessarily because it was against the Quran, but because it was against some of those other established authorities that people thought backed up the religious teachings that were present. In Arabia, and then moving into Egypt, we have Ibn al-Haytham, or al-Hazan, as he was called in Europe, and he worked really a lot on the eye, along with another man we'll talk about in a moment called Ibn al-Nafis, and he wrote a lot about optics. And one of my favorite things here, if you haven't figured it out already, I'm a huge nerd. So, his theory, or one of his contributions was to prove without a doubt that vision happened in what was called an intromissive way, in that light came into the eye and that's how vision happened. At the time, the prevalent theory was called the extromissive vision of the eye, meaning you shot eye beams out wherever you went, and you see where I'm going with the geek thing now, so think Superman with his laser sight going on there. And so the idea was you were like a bat. You were sending light or eye beams out and it was refracting back at you that way. Another theory I love is that they thought everything in the world was constantly losing its outer coating and just floating away, and our eyes were picking up that little bit of it peeling off and coming out at us. So yeah, he was able to show that optics only really worked if you thought about things coming into the eye. And, I love this, he had the radical idea that hypotheses should be proved by experiment and actually backed up with data, even math would be fantastic. So he was really right ahead in the vanguard. Now, Avicenna is the name we have for this guy, and deep breath, Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn Abdullah ibn al-Hasan ibn Ali ibn Sena. I've since been informed by some of our Muslim students that Ibn just means son of, so we're getting this guy's whole genealogy with his name there. So he was a Persian scholar, and he traveled all over the place, and he was very much well-read on Plato and Aristotle, and he considered himself to be very much devout Muslim, but also thought that Galen was very much right on and kind of a predecessor of the truth that came along with his religious teachings thereafter. And he wrote a ton of things, one of the most comprehensive being called the Canon of Medicine, that had 14 volumes, and this thing was so comprehensive it saw use up until the 18th century. I mean, you can still buy it, but it was actually used as a resource for medical thinking up until the 1700s. Now, he was a big proponent of what's called the miasma theory of disease, and this is going to crop up a lot in subsequent lectures. This is the idea that bad air, impure air coming from swamps or mines or things like that, can cause disease. And think about it, it's not a ridiculous idea. If you have pockets of carbon dioxide in a mine that can kill people, that's bad air. If you have swamps and marshy areas, maybe it's not the air, but there could be other infectious processes that are present there that could kill people, and you associate it with that bad air. So the miasma theory of disease, that bad air causes disease, really gets kickstarted with Avicenna. And then there's Averroes, who actually worked as a judge in Spain, what we now call Spain, but was called Al-Andalus. Actually, I found out recently it's called that because the Vandals, who sacked the Roman Empire, settled in Spain, and so they called it Al-Vandalus, which became the place of the Vandals, and then became Al-Andalus, and now we just call it Spain and Portugal. But okay, I can see that is interest only to me. Moving on. So he was also a committed Aristotelian, did lots of commentaries on why Aristotle was correct, and Avicenna, and why Plato didn't quite have it right down, and tried really hard to integrate Aristotle into the medical thought that was present in Galen. And this was important because this became the basis for a lot of medieval scholarship into medicine, and essentially his work became the gateway for Aristotle to become the main player in intellectual thought in Europe in the Middle Ages. And by the way, in the Middle Ages, Muslim scholars were so revered for their insight that European authors would give themselves fake Arabic names to try to appear that they were coming from either Spain or the Middle East, and that therefore people would buy their books. All right, and I think last we have Ibn al-Nafis, who was in Damascus and then moved to Egypt at the request of the Sultan, who was in Cairo at that time. And he did different studies on the eyes, much like Alhazen, and described pulmonary circulation before anyone else and theorized that there could be capillaries in the lungs. So we're getting really tantalizingly close to the idea of circulation of the blood. Now, he knew that Galen was wrong about several things, including the fact that blood did not go between the right and left ventricles in humans. There might be some holes in other animals, like crocodiles, but people did not have, connections directly between the right and left ventricles unless there was a disease. And it's also very probable that he performed some human dissection despite it being culturally frowned upon at the time. And I love this quote of his: "We shall rely necessarily on verified examination and straightforward research, disregarding whether our opinion will agree or disagree with those of our predecessors." So this sounds like we could be having a scientific revolution happening back in the 1200s. So why didn't we have that happen in these Islamic cultures? Well, the answer is Genghis Khan. There we go. So Genghis Khan came in and basically just destroyed Baghdad and Damascus. It was said that when the Mongol hordes made it to Damascus, they raided the houses of wisdom, and that the rivers ran black with ink from the writings that were thrown in the river, prior to them running red with blood from the people who were then killed as the conquest continued. So that pretty much put an end to the intellectual activity in in those centers, and a lot of the scholars who were not just Muslim but also Christian and Jewish scholars working in the Islamic empires then fled to Europe. And Europe had been relatively stagnant in a lot of ways. I don't want to denigrate some of the things that happened in the Middle Ages. It wasn't all bad, it was just mostly bad. But one thing that did happen is that universities had developed because it was felt that there needed to be places where people could learn the main three professions: theology, law, and medicine. Now, I'll give you one guess. Which one of those was bottom of the totem pole? Medicine, yeah. So if you were a relatively noble family, you wanted your sons to inherit your land. Second son could go into the church. Third son hopefully went into the military. And if you were really unlucky, they went into law. And if it was just disgraceful, they went into medicine. So these universities existed, and they did have a medical faculty, so thankfully there was some learning going on there. And prominent places like Bologna, Montpellier, Paris, and Padua, northern Italy, and Salerno, were places where these universities got a firm grounding in one place. Early universities were just traveling. They just followed whatever professors people were traveling with or following, but then we actually got places that had permanent universities present. Now, this is the Middle Ages, so what's the most important thing about learning? What do you guys see in both of these pictures? Lots of reading, lots of books, because it's still all about the authorities, knowing the authoritative sources, what Galen, what Aristotle, what other people have said about various things. So knowledge of the body was actually very primitive. But what's interesting is dissection wasn't necessarily prohibited in medieval Europe. It was just frowned upon because there was a papal bull saying that crusaders' bodies could not be disassembled or their bones boiled to make it easy to bring them home. And some people had thought that that meant, oh, you can't cut into the body. But it wasn't really completely forbidden. And in fact, one of the popes, Sixtus IV, who did some really terrible stuff, but one thing he did nicely for us, was that he said dissections could proceed on the bodies of executed criminals, not so much for medical reasons, but so that artists could more appropriately depict the human body, which is one reason Renaissance art has such a great view of the human body and why it's so accurate in a lot of ways. So once or twice a year in many universities, you would have medical dissections, but because it's the Middle Ages, it really wasn't about finding anything new. It was about reinforcing the authority of Galen and others. So the winter courses usually were there because embalming wasn't a thing, and you start with the viscera first before moving on to the limbs. Now, we do it the opposite here, but why would it be a really good idea to start with the organs back in those days? They're the first thing to rot. So the muscles aren't going to go as quickly, but yeah, you want to get those out as quickly as you can. Now, these dissections, again, they were largely there just to prove the authority of what we were being told. People were encouraged to look at these dissections as a way of verifying, as much as a way of just being like, yes, Galen's wonderful because he described all this, just look at it. So what's fun is it's where we get a lot of our terms for things. So right up there in the booth was the professor or the lector. And the professor read from the Galenic text and professed the truth of it while seated, probably not even looking at the dissection. Meanwhile, an instructor called an ostensor had a stick, and the ostensor would point at the stuff in the body relative to that was related to what the professor was talking about at any given time. And last and least, the person actually cutting the body, moving the organs around, was probably a barber or a butcher. And this is the sector, the person who actually did the cutting. And this person was probably illiterate, didn't really have any knowledge of the intellectual theory that they were trying to get across. He was just moving stuff around. And you can imagine you're not going to see much as a student. It's going to be stinky. It's going to be foul. It's going to be hard to see anything. And the point really wasn't to see anything new. It was to see that, oh yeah, Galen's right, and we're moving on. Now, public anatomy demonstrations actually were relatively well attended. They were actually kind of early entertainment, and they could get pretty rowdy. They were actually considered to be duels and food fights recorded. At various dissections, the food fight always gets me. And students at a lot of these universities were separated based on the nation from which they came. So you'd have Italian and English students swearing at each other and screaming, at each other from across the room, and so forth. And they timed the executions so that they would be in time for these anatomical demonstrations. And because it was considered that the body had to be intact for the judgment day, it was just considered to be kind of an extra punishment for particularly reprehensible criminals, because it was going to kind of forever keep their body disintegrated when they go to the afterlife. So sometimes you could play some music in there. There's I personally want to pull this off before I retire. Fabricius, who's an anatomist at Padua, would have purple and gold robes as he'd come in, and he'd actually have like a band playing him onto the stage. So Fabricius had his own theme music. I'm definitely getting that done before I retire. But as I mentioned, the main target for dissection was not necessarily medical students, but it was more for the artists. Now, I should mention, it was thought that medicine had to get better so that they could deduce the cause of disease and the cause of death for kings, queens, popes, and so forth. So there was a medical push. But the artists in the Renaissance really did quite a bit of dissection. And if you look at medieval art compared to what came before, early medieval art to late medieval art, the knowledge of the human body, the muscle groups, and just the way it moves is night and day. It's just so much better. We got the Pieta in Rome over there. I've seen it in person. It looks amazing. Michelangelo did that when he was like 23. Oh. Now, at 17, Michelangelo was actually allowed to dissect cadavers in a hospital in exchange for making them a crucifix for their altar. And he did dissection. He didn't particularly enjoy it, but he did dissection as a means to get better at being an artist. And that's why his surface anatomy representations are really, really solid. And it's considered that he hid anatomical details in his art. Now, there's a whole cottage industry of anatomists right now, quote unquote, finding anatomy stuff in Michelangelo, and I think a lot of times it's a really big stretch. Other times, all right. So it's thought that Michelangelo did have some anatomy stuff that he hid in his text. Here's one, little bit of a stretch. God's suprahyoid and infrahyoid area, is it actually a medulla? Okay, maybe. And then right there, is that a kidney? Maybe. So these are all things people have claimed that they've found in Michelangelo that are indicative of his anatomy knowledge. My personal favorite thing about Michelangelo is his dad wanted him to become a lawyer and was very upset that he was an artist. And he knew that dissecting was a way that Michelangelo was getting better at art. So one time his dad caught him coming home late from dissecting, and Michelangelo defended himself by saying, like, no, I was hanging out with loose women and drinking with my friends. So Leonardo da Vinci, the big name at the time, of course, made very, very detailed anatomical sketches. Now, if you look at the picture on the right here, there's a cross-section. No one ever had done a cross-section before. No one knew about this. This was just Da Vinci being light years ahead of everyone else for so many reasons. The drawing of the skull there that he did, showing all the air sinuses, he discovered so many things, but his sketches were hidden or lost or kind of dispersed after his death. Plus, he was constantly afraid of kind of offending the authorities with the anatomical work because he did question quite a few of the Galenic truisms at the time. So he discovered a lot of problems with Galen, but he wasn't able to publish it despite wanting to actually have an anatomy text published with an anatomist. Leonardo da Vinci did a lot of great things, but he left 10 times more unfinished works behind him than he actually finished anything. So he had lots of dreams, but sadly that anatomy knowledge kind of stayed with him until the first modern anatomist, a guy named Andreas Vesalius. So he was the son of a physician up in Northern Europe in the Netherlands, and his house was up on a hill. His dad was a physician to the king, and every day he'd go down to Brussels and he'd walk past the execution grounds where the criminals were executed, and their habit then was to leave them on the gibbet until their body just fell apart. So every day he'd walk by and he'd get to see the stages of decomposition that the body was going through. He'd get to kind of see the bones and the ligaments as they fell. And he actually took some of the bones, home and kind of looked at them. So just as a child, he had really good understanding of what the anatomy of the body actually was through watching and observing this process as he worked. So he went to Louvain, then to Paris, and finally got a doctorate of medicine in Padua. And at the time, they really weren't concerned about anatomy. They didn't have someone to teach it, so they just offered him the professorship as soon as he graduated with his doctorate, and he became the chair of surgery and anatomy there. Now, the great thing is, he didn't particularly care for the way he'd been taught. He didn't care for the professor droning on and some guy with a stick, being bored and pointing at something. So he brought a mounted skeleton, very much thought to be one of the executed criminals from his hometown that he carried around with him and put up on hung from kind of a stand. And he used that to teach as he dissected. He did the dissection instead of having someone do it for him. And he really, one of my heroes, because he really thought that you had to get your hands dirty. You had to do stuff to learn stuff. So his dissections and his observations convinced him that Galen was just simply wrong about many aspects of human anatomy. And they're not trivial things. The skeletal details and muscle attachments were wrong because they were based on other primates, not actual humans. Blood can't go from the right to the left ventricle and vice versa. And humans have no rete mirabile, this network of vessels at the base of the brain. Now that's a big deal. This is the entire underpinning of Galen's physiology, and it's wrong. There's nothing there. So he was struck by why there are so many errors, and the poetic version of how he phrased this is, because Galen dissected so many apes in the Barbary area, the Barbary apes, said, well, Galen was misled by his monkeys. He basically assumed that all human anatomy correlated to this anatomy from another primate. So imagine what that's like. He has disproven Galen. He has shown through dissection that these things are not the way they've said to be. How do you think his colleagues and supervisors took this? Yeah, this is not the thing to do in the early Renaissance, late Middle Ages. He's countering the authority that's almost unquestionable to the same level as the church, and so he just got in lots of fights with his colleagues. He eventually just threw all of his works into a fire and went into private practice, became one of the court physicians for the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and later his son Philip II, and that got to be tiring too. He really didn't care for being the one of many court physicians that the emperor might or might not listen to. So he went on a pilgrimage, but on the way back died on a Greek island called Zakynthos, and there's a statue there in his honor to this day. I'm going to tell you a quick story, and my wife will start blushing because this is hilarious. A few years ago, she and her friends went on a big girls' trip to Italy and Greece, and she said, "Oh yeah, we're going to this Greek beach island. It's this really great resort island." I was like, "Oh, cool. What's its name?" She says, "Zakynthos." I'm like, "You picked the one island I really want to go to, and you don't even know why it's important to me." Yeah. But yeah, so I haven't yet seen it, but I'll get there someday. Hit the clubs and then see the Vesalius the statue there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what anatomy was like before Vesalius, because the main thing to know about Vesalius is he didn't just write, he employed an artist to actually draw so that people could see what the real anatomy was based on what he found. So here we have, kind of attributed to a sketch from Avicenna, Anatomy of the Skeleton. Okay, now if you squint, you can make out which bones are which. Ribs look awfully thin. Kind of a big blocky radius and humerus there, but I mean, okay. But I defy you to tell me what's going on in this illustration. Let's see, do I have a, no, I don't have a laser pointer. But yeah, so first off, the heart is basically hanging out in the abdomen. It's way over on the left. I think that's the stomach. I have no idea what those tubes are connecting everything. And basically, yeah, this is what anatomical illustration was, because people were not trying to draw it to make it accurate. They're trying to draw it to get the concepts of Galenic, Aristotelian, or other medical theories through. So Vesalius hired a student of Titian's, a guy named Stephen von Kalkar, and in his book, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the makeup of the human body, these are the illustrations that were present in that book. It had 2 editions. Now, Vesalius is not perfect. There are errors in Vesalius, but in a pinch, I could teach an anatomy course using these books, using these illustrations. They're good enough with what we now know to be the structure of the human body to get a lot of that material through. So even though it's not perfect, it's really just a massive step forward in terms of understanding the human body. All right. Of course, my family's here. What's my best day ever? Was it the day I graduated with my PhD? Mom and Dad looking proud? Ooh, wedding. Oh, that's a good day. That's a good day. Outside, New Harmony, Indiana. Good times. Or maybe the birth of my children. Ah, my wife looking way more photogenic than anyone has a right to immediately after delivery. Or is it the day I got to examine a copy of De Humanis Corpora Fabrica myself? No one will ever know. Okay. So, last for today is kind of our bridge between early Renaissance medicine and modern medicine. And this is William Harvey. He was another student at Padua, but he was from England and returned there after he got his medical degree in Padua. And he came after Vesalius, but benefited from a lot of that experimental mindset that had taken root despite Vesalius' colleagues' effort. And so he started working for the King of England and was actually given a lot of resources, and he started investigating embryology and reproduction was one thing, but the thing he's most known for is he really did not believe that Galen's theory about blood flow made any sense at all. If the liver is sending out blood all the time to organs and it's just washing over these organs, well, where's it going and what's happening to it? It just made no sense. There's no circularity in Galen. Now, apparently he was unaware, as far as we can tell, of Ibn al-Nafis, who had theorized about the pulmonary circulation already. But Harvey tied off the pulmonary artery with a ligature and basically found that you could not get blood to move across the ventricular septum, no matter how much pressure you put fluid in there under. And only after you release that ligature to the lungs did blood then start moving back into the ventricles. So there had to be movement of blood from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart, and then to the rest of the body. So he's basically the person who figured out circulation, and it stuck. We got that knowledge and it stayed with us. And he actually did the first quantitative study recorded in the history of Western medicine, because basically he figured out how much blood filled a ventricle, how much that blood weighed. And if that blood was being pumped all the time but didn't have a new source and wasn't being recycled, then we would have to be producing over 540 pounds of new blood every single day. So it wasn't just going into the organs and disappearing. It had to be going somewhere. So even though there was no microscopes, he theorized that capillaries must exist to bring blood from arteries to veins. And what really is amazing is he was able to show how the veins drain by doing little experiments by kind of milking the blood out of superficial veins and seeing that it would open up if you lifted your finger one way, but not another. And it's just amazing, no one had really put this together despite the fact that venipuncture and bleeding of people had been done forever, and it just very much demonstrated that blood flows proximally from veins and distally through arteries. All right, so now we've reached basically the Renaissance, and we're going to take our time for the next few sessions to talk about different aspects of medicine now that we have kind of a common foundation to work from. So next time, we're going to be talking about concepts of health and disease throughout history, or basically the history of pathology. And thank you guys so much. I really appreciate you coming.